Hello, and welcome to Arctic Implications, Security versus Environmentalism in the Far North, an Introduction. The Arctic region traditionally has held more appeal to anthropologists, historians, and biologists than political scientists, yet since the late 1990s, we have seen growing political and social interest in Arctic changes. These changes that stem from resource availability and climate change have tremendous implications for Arctic states and stakeholders alike. In particular, the Arctic states are seeing the rise of two kinds of threats in the north: security threats from military expansion and environmental threats through climate change. We must therefore ask a question that policymakers are thinking about with increased urgency. How do far north states balance developing military threats with the environmental threats of an opening Arctic? We will see that the way states frame these two challenges and the prioritization of these two issues depends heavily on each state's history in the Arctic and its identity as a normative state. The Arctic has not been of such strategic interest since the Cold War. While an all-out interstate war in the Arctic is unlikely, some scholars consider a proliferation of broader security challenges in an opening Arctic to be unavoidable. This underscores the importance of establishing venues of cooperation. It is through this need for cooperation that we see a reconciliation between security and ecosystems in the Arctic. State cooperation on environmental issues can serve as a pressure valve for security tensions, meaning environmental cooperation has the potential to create issue and interest linkages that facilitate interstate trust. Scholar Orrin Young headed a wave of political interest in the Arctic in 1998, as the opening of the Arctic had significant implications for state relationships. States try to increase their presence to increase their resource claims, establish trade routes, and create a military presence. The big five Arctic players, those that have the greatest claims to the north, are Norway, Denmark, Canada, the United States, and Russia. Even states that do not have existing claims to the far north by virtue of geography, for example, China, Japan, and the European Union, are attempting to increase their influence in the region. While the Arctic is often portrayed as a pristine ecosystem reserved for scientists and explorers, institution scholar Young says there is nothing sacred about the Arctic. It is a region of conflict and challenges just like any other. In the scramble of states to establish legitimate claims, there is fear that the region will descend into military conflict. Since 2000, even Norway and Denmark have responded to challenges by increasing their military presence. Within the Arctic, several trends emerge in how states are grouped together. These groups tend to be based on shared interests and identity values. States that value human rights formation within the Arctic and emphasize the region's scientific value include Norway, Denmark, and Finland. These states act according to what is called a logic of appropriateness, which says that actors make decisions based on what is appropriate to their values and identity. This idea runs contrary to states who act purely in terms of self-interest or material gain. True to their identities, Norway and Denmark have a stakeholder scientific emphasis in the north. Much of their identities are based on complying with human rights and information-sharing norms. They are sometimes framed as norm entrepreneurs who try to shape compliance and development. This can especially be seen through their tenures as Arctic Council secretariats. During their time in this position, Norway emphasized climate change, and Denmark highlighted sustainable development, and both recognized the fragile nature of the Arctic. Conversely, the United States and Russia while at odds in non-Arctic regions, are often grouped together in the Arctic based off their shared interests. These states not only indicate a willingness to aggressively expand, Russia in particular, but also indicate a willingness to stake claims to natural resources. Both states' statements on the North indicate a greater focus on the region's strategic potential than on ecosystems. The identities of these two states are not tied to environmental concerns in the same way that other liberal Arctic states are. While a number of non-Arctic players are playing an increasing role in the North, they are not often considered through the same logic of appropriateness as the far North players. Instead of considering their identities, many scholars believe states such as China, Japan, and the European Union are more drawn to the region for its material incentives. These three classes of states, appropriate logic states, security states, and material incentive states, have indicated different levels of willingness to bring militaries into the Arctic. Some scholars are skeptical about the possibility of Arctic military conflict, given the amiable relations of the region being too strong to be undermined. Politicians clearly recognize the need for a cooperation venue in the far North. Vladimir Putin elaborated in a statement in 2010, "We think that preserving the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation is of the utmost importance." Yet this vague statement was not connected to any identification of issues. Cooperation, while desired, has remained a vague concept, highlighted only by the identity politics and narratives of the Nordic states. Is a concern with security in the Arctic mutually exclusive to environmental protections? Not necessarily, though there are some elements that can complicate a state's full dedication to either of these goals. Environmental policy can challenge the idea of sovereignty. Traditionally understood of as the right to exist as a state, the Arctic presents two expansions of that definition. First, sovereignty is a right to self-determination and autonomy. This means that not only do states have the right to make decisions regarding their development, but national groups, such as the Inuit, Sami, or Nenets, deserve these rights as well. Liberal states critique Arctic military expansion as posing a risk to the sovereignty of these groups. Some policymakers critique Arctic institutions, such as the Arctic Council, for its leading role in developing state environmental treaties. They claim that the Council has no right to impose on the state's internal conduct. States that value sovereignty typically also support the right of a state to establish military presence within its own jurisdiction. The second understanding of sovereignty addresses existing states. Sovereignty is undergoing a redefinition to see if it can allow for greater maritime claims. As the state's territory increases, so does its potential military expansion. Another current issue that illustrates this phenomenon is China's construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea. Within Arctic literature, there is the overwhelming belief that cooperation is the key means to attain peace in the Arctic. While some authors address the possibility of responding to Arctic aggression with a buildup of balancing powers, it's speculative, never seriously developed as an idea as create issue linkages to discourage conflict. Within the far north region, there is general agreement to comply with the logic of appropriateness that influences liberal states. One could argue Russia even commits to this logic, although in recognition that its identity values military security over council-directed environmental programs. From the first surges of Arctic interest, there has been a strong commitment to institutional compliance. The creation of the Arctic Council, in fact, emerged almost in tandem with increased Western attention. framing Arctic security is dominated by efforts to address issues in a way that conforms to the existing frameworks. This adherence is reasonable, given the young age of Arctic cooperation, but it also sets the stage for creating a pressure valve for security tensions. Most marine disputes have been addressed by applying existing frameworks, such as the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Most states and scholars recognize this carryover of organizational processes, believing using familiar paths is the best strategy to foster cooperation. An illustration of path following appears with territory disputes. Most disputes take place outside the realm of traditional land disputes. Some scholars are skeptical about these marine disputes building into armed clashes, as there is such a common expectation of existing rule-based problem solving. We can think of this in context of exclusive economic zones, or EEZs. Even though most disputes fall outside of these zones, think Hans Island, the principles of these existing laws are being carried forward into proposed maritime framework. However, what is considered the best option by most is clearly not the best option of all. Young critiques the predominant view. By drawing too closely from existing institutions, we walk a fine line of being too constrained by path dependence. Carrying over institutional biases is dangerous. Russia already faces insecurity in Western-dominated security and rights institutions. If the Arctic cannot be a safe haven from Western-led, security-oriented expansion, Russian politicians may react aggressively to carve out its niche. Regardless of the form of regime the Arctic should take, there's no doubt that rules to shape the region are necessary. Creating a comprehensive treaty is difficult, as it would lack an enforcement mechanism. While this could be overcome if the region were limited to one hegemonic power, because the United States and Russia are two strong states in a small region, shaming, along with other mechanisms, becomes implausible. Ultimately, states do act in accordance with their identities and choose strategies strategically based on their perception of other states' identities. For example, Norway or Finland is unlikely to sway Russia through environmental appeals on behalf of their indigenous populations. Russia offers both the largest military threat and is also the least likely to be swayed by Aboriginal appeals. What one state values may not be a fundamental part of another state's identity. Part of the Arctic Council's appeal is that it promotes a secular Arctic. The Council does not have a history of addressing security concerns. However, some states and NGOs have claimed the Council should provide these services. The Arctic Council tries to resolve two regional challenges. First, the need to resolve jurisdictional issues, and second, the need to propose solutions for the protection of ecosystems in the Arctic. These goals come from two building threats: the conflict between states that results from strategic trade route competition, and the environmental degradation that follows such conflicts. One such example of the latter threat stems from the Cold War, where Russia revealed that it had dumped enormous amounts of radioactive materials in the Arctic seas and Siberia. Beyond waste disposal, accidents like Chernobyl illustrate the destructive effects of state development on the far north. Environmental treaties are a volatile subject for Russia. In response to Scandinavian urging to clean the waste, it has threatened to pull cooperation on other issues. Given environmental treaty cooperation is intended to relax tensions, states must think wisely about which issues to push. If not framed as a pressure valve, environmental issues could conflict with security ambitions. Given the economic benefits states seek and their desire for natural resources, norms compliance is likely to be a challenge. States must develop a more detailed plan of environmental partnership to maintain an issue of common interest. This cooperation venue has the potential to succeed in relieving military pressures. It is a soft issue topic which will not cause insecurity among states. There are several NGOs already involved in ecosystem maintenance, collecting data on ecological diversity, disposing of radioactive waste, and addressing the connections between global carbon credit systems and Arctic ice. Ultimately, environmental cooperation does not have to be at odds with establishing military security. It can instead be understood as a venue for minimizing tensions that come from military expansion. Moreover, intergovernmental familiarity has the potential to lessen tensions and establish trust that transfers from one government branch to another. State partnership with NGOs conforms to the non-threatening secular nature of the Arctic. Sharing knowledge and compiling information databases serves two purposes. First, they guide states in reframing the Arctic as a region of scientific cooperation, not military expansion. Second, information disseminating strengthens departmental trust. Voluntary environmental cooperation is also acceptable to most states. Moreover, cooperation highlights security problems that come from climate change. It is crucial that Arctic states reconcile, rather than choose between, environmentalism and security. Otherwise, states may create an environment where even identity-driven countries must build militaries or partner with the stronger nations. We conclude with the question, what is the future of the Arctic? While uncertainty exists, something in its organizational culture helps keep tension from turning to disaster. Institutional influence can increase in breadth and depth by focusing on environmental venues for cooperation, which have longer policy life than jurisdictional claims. Norway and Denmark put emphasis on environmental protection. Their desire to create effective environmental frameworks through the Arctic Council may prevent the Council from developing into a purely security institution. Promoting environmental protection, given its many manifestations and policy directions, is an effective way of mitigating military tensions. This indicates security and sustainability are reconcilable in the Arctic.